we have today the benefit of Claire Clement, the Director of International Law and Policy at the Red Cross, and Professor Marco Sassoli, Professor of International Law at the University of Geneva. Both of them are giving evidence virtually, and we are very grateful to them for their time. Thank you so much for coming. The evidence that you're giving in this Israel-Palestine conflict hearing is extremely important. We know that in the debate about Palestine and Gaza in particular, that people frequently say it's a breach of international law. This is an international crime. They challenge politicians to say, call this out as a crime. Words are bandied around. Courts are invoked. There seems to be more heat than light very often in this debate. And what we would like to do is to put onto the record and into evidence in our inquiry exactly what international law in relation to the Gaza conflict is, so that we can use it as a baseline. And I wondered if you would be kind enough for us to actually begin with the basics and we'll work from ground up, so that anyone listening to it who doesn't know anything about international law will be informed by it, and indeed those of us who may know quite a lot will also, I think, be reminded of some important factors in relation to it, so that the debate that we have in the UK is informed by the evidence that you give, and we're grateful to you for being here to help us. So can I perhaps just start with asking you to give us an overview of the legal framework that applies to all armed conflicts, including the war in Gaza. And I wonder if I could ask Claire Clement if she'd be kind enough to begin that, and then perhaps we can ask the Professor to speak afterwards.
Of course, and thanks very much for having me this morning. Just to confirm that I'm from the British Red Cross, and as a humanitarian auxiliary to the public authorities in the UK, we have a special responsibility to help to disseminate and promote and implement international humanitarian law, or IHL. I'm going to be using that acronym quite a lot, and I hope that's okay.
Claire, if I might just interrupt you. Sorry, Claire Clement. Again, absolutely no problem with you using the acronym, but if when you're giving your answer, would you be kind enough just, again, because given that we're going back to basics, would you mind just explaining perhaps the difference between international law, human rights law, international humanitarian law, because they are used as sort of interchangeable terms. And again, for people just coming completely cold to this, if you would help us with that as well in your answer.
Of course, no problem at all. So, international humanitarian law, or IHL, is also known as the law of war or the law of armed conflict. So you may also hear it interchangeably referred to as those things. Those are exactly the same things when they're called by those names. IHL is part of public international law, so it's part of a much broader field of public international law. That field of public international law is primarily made up of treaties and also customary laws, and we can get into that as well if you like. That broader field of public international law includes, as well as IHL, human rights law, international refugee law, and a range of other international laws that apply between states and also between states and international organisations. IHL is separate to human rights law, so it's sometimes misunderstood as a subset or somehow connected into human rights law. They are distinctly separate bodies of law. However, they do have a number of fundamental rules within them that look the same. For example, both bodies of law prohibit the use of torture, inhumane and degrading treatment, but they do have a number of distinct differences. So human rights law, just to say, applies all the time, both in peacetime and also in situations of armed conflict. IHL applies to situations of armed conflict. There are a few rules of IHL that apply in peacetime, but they are a bit of an outlier, a bit of an exception. The vast majority of IHL applies exclusively in situations of armed conflict.
If I might again rudely interrupt, I mean, we know people will have heard of Strasbourg and the International Court of Human Rights, which sits whether there's law, during peacetime, and that's perhaps quite a good example and shows how it is that human rights law applies at all times.
That's right, exactly. So that's a really big difference between IHL and international human rights law, that IHL is the specialised body of law that applies both in international armed conflicts and also in non-international armed conflicts. And we can come on to that in a minute, but it's certainly the case that there are separate means in terms of determining what those rules are that apply both at the international level and in countries as well. There are separate treaties of IHL, which we can also come on to, which a number of you may be familiar with. So those cornerstone rules are really enshrined in the 1949 four Geneva Conventions. I'm sure you may have all heard of these. There are a number of other important IHL treaties as well. Human rights treaties are separate to those. You have the Declaration on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration, you have the Convention on the Rights of the Child. These are all separate treaties that apply in the human rights space to those specialised international humanitarian law or IHL rules. If I can come on to a really core definition of IHL for you, it's often described as that body of law that protects persons who are not or who are no longer taking part in the hostilities. And by hostilities, we mean fighting, we mean the warfare itself. So these persons who are not or who are no longer taking part in that fighting really refer to the sick, wounded and captured military personnel, as well as those who don't fight at all. So this is in particular civilians who are protected under IHL, but other specific categories as well, including medical personnel. So all these groups, in accordance with IHL, have to be treated humanely, and there are a variety of rules that govern the treatment to which those different groups are entitled. Separate to this protective aspect of IHL, it also imposes limits on what we often refer to as the means and methods of warfare. So this would be the weaponry, the tactics, and the strategies that are used by warring parties when they're fighting conflicts. So I hope that makes sense so far. I don't know if you'd like me to stop.
And I think also if you could just, because you did say that you'd refer to practice and norms, I think perhaps we ought to explain what that is as well.
Absolutely. So public international law, so not just IHL, but all of the bodies of public international law, including human rights law, international refugee law and other bodies, are generally found within the same sources. So these are primarily treaty law. So those are the written rules that are agreed between states and between states and international organisations. Treaties are often called conventions, covenants, protocols, as well as treaties themselves. They go by a variety of names, but they all mean the same thing. They are the written rules. When states agree those rules and agree to those treaties, they bind the parties to those treaties only. So they do not bind those that do not sign up and ratify those treaties. Another source of public international law, which is also very important in IHL, is what we call customary international law or customary rules. Now, custom is different to treaty rules, to those written rules. It can be written down, but it doesn't have to be. We find and identify custom in the practice of states. So it's this uniform and virtually consistent practice of states where we can say that, well, a customary rule is therefore being identified. But critically, it's not just that practice. Those states must also intend that that practice will bind them legally. So there's a two-part element to identifying and defining customary rules of international law. It's quite a high bar to identify it. It can be quite difficult. However, it's powerful when it is crystallized, because in fact customary rules don't just bind those states who are practicing that rule, they bind all states. So customary rules can be critical, and they're critical in international humanitarian law, in IHL, in, for example, filling gaps where we don't have many treaty rules. And this is in certain areas of IHL, in particular when we come to non-international armed conflicts. So those conflicts that aren't state-to-state conflicts, but are between non-state armed groups or between states fighting non-state armed groups.
Is there
so also I hope that's clear on the general two categories.
Is there another side of the coin as well, which is that if you have a law which develops on the basis of custom, that there can be a threat to law if that custom is broken by a particular state and other states don't stop that state from breaking it. So it's as if it's then accepted because no one's doing anything about it, and so a custom can change.
Well, that's true in terms of the development of custom. You can also have rules around the development of customary laws, including one around persistent objectors to those laws. So you can have virtually uniform, virtually consistent state practice, but you can still have states that are what we call persistent objectors to those laws and do not sort of subscribe to that custom, for example. But you're absolutely right in the sense that custom can develop and change over time. If you're interested in looking at customary rules pertaining to international humanitarian law, I mean, I'm from the British Red Cross. There was a study done of customary rules of international humanitarian law a couple of decades ago now by the International Committee of the Red Cross. So just to clarify, it's not the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross to define that custom, but they have an authoritative voice, an advisory function in this way. And they developed a study which defined actually over 160 rules of customary international humanitarian law. Now, through that study, the British Red Cross and the International Committee of the Red Cross have an ongoing project based out of Cambridge University with a team of researchers, which serves to identify and define the state practice which applies to those rules. So it's looking for evidence of military doctrine, of political speeches, of all sorts of other guidance and legislation and frameworks which would lend themselves to further providing evidence that those customary rules exist, and also to how they develop over time.
I think of it as being a little bit like British law, in that British law is made from statutes, i.e. the international agreements, and then judge-made law, which is customary practice, so that you get both of those things seeming to happen at the same time. I appreciate it's a bit rough and ready, but I've personally found that quite helpful. I was just going to say, I just wondered if I could perhaps move on to Professor Marco Sassoli. And I wondered if there was anything. We've had quite a comprehensive answer, but I wondered if there was anything that Claire Clement might have missed, or anything that you think that would be helpful to add.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having invited me. I'm very honored. I fully agree with everything Claire Clement said. Understandably, as she is from the Red Cross, she didn't mention another branch which has to be totally separated, but which is important for armed conflict and which the Red Cross does not deal with. It's the prohibition of the use of force and the exceptions to the prohibition of the use of force. So an armed conflict should normally not happen, because under the United Nations Charter it is prohibited to use force, but there are exceptions, in particular self-defense and UN Security Council authorization. But what is important is whether one fights legitimately or not does not influence the humanitarian rules one has to comply with. So to give an example from a current conflict, both Russia and Ukraine have to comply with exactly the same rules of international humanitarian law, and Ukraine couldn't say, no, but we can't comply with these rules because we were attacked. Well, humanitarian law has precisely been made for situations where one state attacks another state, or where a dictatorial government oppresses the people, or where a terrorist armed group fights against a democratic government. That could be if there is a sufficient level of violence and of organization, an armed conflict, and there again, both parties have to comply with the same humanitarian rules, simply because it is not the fault of, say, the civilians to be on the wrong side of the conflict. And anyway, during the conflict, at least the parties never agree, and we see that in the Israel-Palestine conflict, who is legitimately using force and who is a victim of an aggression. And therefore, the rules must be the same. That's the only point I wanted to add.
Can I ask you one other question, though, Professor, which is that, whilst it's accepted that, of course, it's accepted that states can use force to defend themselves, is there a limit on the force that can be used when a state defends itself?
Yes, thank you for that question. That's an important one, which is again not an international humanitarian law question, but also under what the lawyers call the jus ad bellum, which are the rules about when the use of force between states or in international relations is lawful. There's also a necessity and proportionality limit, which is not the same than the proportionality rule in international humanitarian law, because it's a global evaluation whether the effects of the self-defense are proportionate to the threat which a state may respond to by self-defense.
So we've got to this. We've sort of asked this question, or you've sort of answered this question in a slightly roundabout way. But may I ask directly, how does international humanitarian law protect civilians, Professor?
I would say the most important rules are four. First, only lawful means of warfare may be used, and so, for instance, chemical weapons are prohibited, or for most states, anti-personnel landmines or cluster munitions. If a lawful means is used, it may only be used against a legitimate target, which are combatants, fighters, members of an armed group with a continuous combat function, and military objectives. Now, if the target is lawful, then still, or precisely in that case, the IHL proportionality rule applies, which says that even if you attack a lawful target, you must stop the attack or not launch the attack if it must be expected that there will be an excessive effect on civilians, death, injury, or destruction of civilian objects compared with the military advantage thought. Now, this is very difficult for all of us to evaluate because we don't know what is the target and we don't know the plans of the belligerents. But even if the proportionality rule is respected, a belligerent must take all feasible precautionary measures when attacking. So, if you destroy, which doesn't happen in Gaza because there are no bridges, but if you target a bridge, and that bridge is a military objective because enemy forces have to move over that bridge to attack you, and you defend yourself, and therefore you destroy the bridge. And obviously, people live around the bridge. You calculate proportionality, and you come to the conclusion that this is not disproportionate, because this is, for instance, the only bridge over that river. Even then, you must take feasible precautions. For instance, attack the bridge, if it is not urgent, by night rather than by day, because less civilians will be around. Or give a warning to the civilians, because the bridge cannot be moved away. So if you warn the civilians, I will attack the bridge in 1 hour, the enemy cannot move the bridge away, and so you can keep the same military advantage while sparing more civilians.
Is there any guidance though? Let's say you have a leader of Hamas who, and you want to kill him, and because he has been responsible for attacking your country. Is it proportionate to let's say bomb his household so that he and all his family are killed, and you can't notify the household because obviously you'd lose him? Is that proportionate? Is it proportionate if he lives in a block of flats to blow up the whole block of flats and not tell anyone within it? I mean, where is the kind of, is it proportionate to blow up a neighbourhood if the leader is sufficiently senior? I mean, who judges this? How do we know whether there has been a breach of law?
First of all, to answer your question, to calculate the proportionality is a delicate thing as such, because you compare two very different things, lives and injury to civilians on the one hand, and something abstract, which is a military advantage. But there is, I think, even more a problem of transparency, which you correctly mentioned, that we don't know. So, for instance, if this was the highest military commander of Hamas, and I must add, there is no other means to get him. I imagine there are no women who are highest military leaders of Hamas, therefore I speak about him. Then this could be proportionate to destroy the entire house where there will be many civilians around. Neighborhood, never, because there are nevertheless, especially Israel has very precise weapons, and so you never have to destroy the whole neighborhood to get one leader. But the most delicate thing is obviously that if it's important to determine how important this leader is. So if this is the overall military leader, then you may take the risk to kill more civilians than if it is a lower leader or a simple Hamas fighter. And at least in my personal opinion, I think this is the most delicate thing on the conduct of hostilities, these rules of what may be targeted in the practice of the Israeli Defense Forces, is that they tell us there are thousands of command of control and control centers, because each time they bomb something, they say this was a legitimate target, but they cannot be all so important that it would justify in each individual case in such a densely populated area to take the risk to kill so many people. So, assuming that they indeed target only Hamas fighters or Hamas equipment or command and control centers, then comes the proportionality rule, which depends of the military importance for their plan, for the Israeli plans, how to get control over the Gaza Strip, how important it is to kill this fighter or to destroy that center or rocket launch station or whatever.
Are you aware that certainly at the beginning of the conflict, the Israeli Defense Force said that they had embedded in the IDF the lawyers who were giving advice on exactly what action was being taken and making sure that it could be justified legally? Is that still the case? Are you aware of whether that's still the case?
I know that the Israeli Defense Forces have indeed a lot of lawyers and very good lawyers. When I see the results, I have unfortunately the impression, but I have no evidence for that, that somehow their advice has been relaxed after the horrible things which happened on the 7th of October. I have the impression that now, if I may put it that way, they took the gloves off, or their commanders told them, take the gloves off, do no longer apply these detailed rules, be more permissive, because we have to destroy this Hamas movement which attacked us. And now, whether the lawyers give a different advice or the entire atmosphere in Israel has led to the fact that simply they do no longer listen to their lawyers, I cannot judge that, because all this is obviously secret and confidential.
Thank you. I think that Edward has a question for you.
Well, just actually to follow on that line of questioning, I'm interested to know whether or not there are countries whose rules of war, if you will, are always in compliance with international humanitarian law, and or if there are countries that you look at and you say, actually, their guidance to their military, their rules of war, are always in breach of international humanitarian law.
No, I think there's never a belligerent who is always in breach. I personally, in the last century, I was a delegate of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Iraq, and there was the war between Iran and Iraq, and Saddam Hussein was a very inhumane regime towards its own population, but for instance the Iranian prisoners of war were more or less treated according to the Third Geneva Convention. Now, on the other hand, there is never perfect respect. If I may, with all due respect, speak about the conduct of British forces in Iraq, or before that in the Falkland War, we discovered that there were violations, but the United Kingdom took measures, including you, Parliament, commissions of inquiry and so on. So there's never perfect respect, but what is important is when there are violations, serious inquiries must be done, and every state party to the Geneva Convention has an obligation to prosecute grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. And there, indeed, you are right, there are some states which do that, and in other states we never hear about prosecutions. But this is, again, I think one shouldn't imagine that its democracies comply and dictatorial regimes don't comply. For very different reasons, no one has, to my knowledge, been tried in the United States for the treatment of detainees in Guantanamo. So, and the United States is a democracy. So it's not governed by the rule of law, but even the US Supreme Court has not been able, also it has taken Guantanamo out of a legal hole, and nevertheless it has not succeeded to make sure that some people are actually punished.
Let me move us on, because I think that Uma has some questions that are probably relevant to this, actually, if I might.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Claire. I have a few questions, so and I appreciate how complicated this subject is, but if you could keep your answers short, perhaps I can get through the questions. what's the difference between the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court? And what are the specific roles of both of those courts in the context of the current conflict in Gaza? Professor, I'll start with you.
No, thank you. This is a very important question we did not yet deal with, and it's very important to understand that violations of international law, including of humanitarian law, are committed by states, while war crimes are committed by individuals. So a state cannot commit war crimes. And war crimes are prosecuted according to international criminal law. And in the first obligation is every country prosecutes those committing war crimes in its armed forces or on its territory and so on. And then we have an international criminal court which has jurisdiction if a war crime is committed either by a national of a state party to the statute or on the territory of a state party to the statute, and the territorial state or the state to which the individual belongs is either unwilling or unable to prosecute. The International Court of Justice does not deal with individuals and does not deal with war crimes. It deals with violations of international law, and one state can bring a violation before the International Court of Justice against another state if both states have accepted the jurisdiction of the court, which is very, very rare. But in the Genocide Convention, and genocide is a very extreme and rare, fortunately, case, there is a clause which gives the International Court of Justice jurisdiction, and this is why South Africa, either it hadn't done anything or it had to claim that Israel commits genocide. South Africa could not have claimed Israel commits violations of international humanitarian law because the Geneva Conventions do not contain such a clause which gives jurisdiction to the International Court of Justice. So, obviously, if both states, if there was, God beware, an armed conflict between the United Kingdom and Switzerland, then the International Court of Justice would have full jurisdiction because both Switzerland and the United Kingdom have accepted general jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, but this is quite rare.
Thank you. And Claire?
Thanks for that. I mean, I think that Professor Sassoli's covered sort of everything in relation to the differences between the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice. So the International Criminal Court being about, investigating serious violations of international laws, including international humanitarian law, and these are generally referred to as war crimes when it refers to serious violations of international humanitarian law, but it also looks at serious violations of other bodies of public international law, including human rights law, and these are called generally crimes against humanity. So again, in the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, these different types of crimes are very nicely, very clearly laid out for us to see. And the International Court of Justice is really about state responsibility. So it has a completely different sort of premise. It technically is able to be applied to all states, even though if states come to that court, they cannot be dragged there. They must consent to that case going on. The International Court of Justice can also issue what we call advisory opinions as well, which is different to the International Criminal Court. So they have completely different purposes, and the ICC is really about that individual criminal responsibility. I should say, in addition to those two very important organs, the IHL treaties themselves, so the Geneva Conventions and the first additional protocol, which was adopted in 1977, also set out some really important mechanisms that are severely underused, but do also aim to ensure better compliance with IHL and implementation of its rules. There's an inquiry mechanism, there is an international humanitarian fact-finding commission, and there is a mechanism called protecting powers. And all of these things have been baked into the treaty rules to have them at the disposal of parties to conflicts, and they have to consent to that use and enact them themselves, so they are underused for that purpose. However, they do exist and they are there in order also to be able to provide, better implementation of the rules.
Thank you. Just two follow-ups, and again, I'm conscious of time, but that was really clear answers from both of you. Thank you. Professor, you touched on the use of the word genocide there, and that is something that is coming up time and time again. And we are seeing these images play out that are horrifying and devastating. And time again, people have asked me, why has the UK government refrained from using the word genocide? Last week, Amnesty International investigation concluded that Israel was committing a genocide for acts prohibited under the Genocide Convention. In November, the UN Special Committee found that the State of Israel's warfare methods in Gaza are consistent with a genocide, including the use of starvation as a weapon of war. And in a separate case that you referred to in South Africa, the court also handed an interim ruling that Israel is committing a genocidal act against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Why do you think the UK government is continuing to refrain from the use of the word genocide? And what implications do these judgments have for the UK law?
Well, thank you. I must say there is not yet a binding decision which says Israel commits genocide, and therefore we don't know the interim measures you mentioned at the request of South Africa. The International Court of Justice ordered certain measures because it considers that it is plausible that there is a risk of genocide. And obviously the acts underlying a genocide, killing, starving, and so on, are the same than for violations of international humanitarian law. What is specific of genocide is that there must be a special intent to destroy a racial, ethnic, and so on group or part of that group. And so the real question is, does Israel want to eliminate Hamas, or do they want to eliminate Palestinians? And in the latest report
I'm so sorry to cut across you. I mean, it's a very important question, and you've said it hasn't been answered yet. So when is it going to be answered, and who will answer it?
Well, that can take, the case before the International Court of Justice can take 2-3 more years. And it is interesting that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court did not ask for an arrest warrant for genocide. But, and in my view, he has a much better case for some violations of international humanitarian law, like the starvation of the civilian population or the forced displacement of civilians, because then he doesn't have to prove the specific intent to destroy the group or part of the group. Even if Israel's only aim is to destroy Hamas, it can violate IHL, while it cannot commit genocide if that's its intent. And simply, from certain conduct, Amnesty International deduces a genocidal intent because it claims, and I don't have the facts, it claims that Israel also deliberately attacks civilians. if this is true, combined with some statements, and the International Court of Justice in its interim measures decision referred to those statements by some Israeli politicians which show a genocidal intent, because they really said we must get rid of these people and eliminate them, and not only Hamas. But these were some politicians. This has never been declared as Israeli policy, but obviously it is very rare that a party that commits genocide declares this as the official policy. So you have to deduce the genocidal intent from the conduct on the ground. And here, for the time being,
I have a further follow-up. I'm just conscious of time, but thank you for the incredibly clear answer. Claire, perhaps I'll go to you. Recently, the United Nations says that upholding international law and ensuring accountability for violations rests squarely on member states, and we've talked about that today. They've said that the failure to do so weakens the very core of the international legal system. So in the context of what is happening in Gaza at the moment, what does this mean for future wars? Why would anybody follow international human rights law if they know that there are no repercussions in the future?
Thanks for this really important question as well. I think all of us here would agree that just because you have, and we absolutely irrefutably do have, a world in which we see many violations of international humanitarian law as well as other international laws at the moment, but just because we have those violations doesn't mean that the laws themselves aren't sound and right. There's always room to develop, there's always room to clarify and interpret. However, those fundamental rules, we would certainly consider them to be sound and legitimate and still worthy of following. And we do spend an awful lot of time in our capacity as the Red Cross promoting the continuing relevance and validity of those rules. However, you're absolutely right in that we do need better and more effective enforcement of the rules, both in terms of their implementation while a conflict is going on, also in terms of seeking accountability and justice for those violations after that's occurred. So in terms of the situation in Gaza, you do have, because of its public profile, because there's so much attention in very, in detailed elements of it, in the media, in the public, in a way that, violations that occur in other conflicts, and there are, numerous that we could discuss, Sudan, elsewhere, that are not getting the same sort of attention really in the public space. But because of that public effect, you do have a situation where, perceived violations and actual violations of IHL in that situation do have a degrading effect on people's perception of the relevance and effectiveness of IHL. We see a worrying situation with our partners on the ground, the ones who are also protected under rules of IHL, who are providing humanitarian relief, that those basic needs that people have in conflicts and that they're entitled to. We see them feeling, despondent and concerned about what they see as a lack of protection for them when they're using the Red Cross and Red Crescent emblems, which are protected under IHL, and when they're trying to navigate space to deliver that life-saving aid and to protect civilians as well. So I agree with you that, we do need to have more effective measures in place to ensure that we have better compliance with the rules. There's a number of organisations, including ours, and states working on initiatives over the next couple of years to do just that. But primarily the responsibility lies with states themselves.
Move on to Blair.
Thank you for your answers so far. As it has been sort of touched upon throughout this, a lot of these issues are deeply contested as to whether a breach of IHL has taken place. I wonder if you could talk us through the mechanisms for the monitoring of whether breaches have taken place, and perhaps give us a commentary as to whether those mechanisms have worked well with regards to the situation in Gaza. And I'll ask Claire first, please.
So it's really, and I'll answer in general terms because that's really the responsibility I have coming to the British Red Cross. So really the responsibility to monitor compliance with IHL and implementation of the rules lies again with states themselves. So IHL requires states to have all of the mechanisms, personnel, and processes and systems in place to be able to effectively monitor their own implementation and compliance with the rules. So that means having in place not just domestic courts and systems like that to ensure accountability, but also, military legal advisors, which is something we've just spoken about earlier. Also to have administrative systems and bodies in place. The whole suite of systems and processes to ensure good implementation. So it obviously is very critical that military forces have this embedded in them. States are also required to have, good education and dissemination processes as well for IHL, not just in terms of military education, but also in terms of civilian education on IHL. And we play an important role in supporting those obligations. In terms of whether that's working well in this instance at the domestic level, it's not really my role to comment on that, but just to say that those requirements and obligations are baked into the treaty law. As well as that, I've mentioned that you have some mechanisms under the treaty law to monitor and ensure better implementation of the rules. So, as I mentioned, that includes an inquiry mechanism. There is a humanitarian fact-finding commission, an independent body of 15 experts that exists under the first additional protocol, which not all states have signed up to, but a great majority have as well. And there's a thing called the protecting powers mechanism, which is in place effectively where the parties to the conflict can designate third parties or third neutral states to monitor compliance with the rules. That happened, the last instance I believe was actually in the Falklands conflict, so some time ago since that was used as well. There are organisations also that play certain protective functions under the treaty laws, and the International Committee of the Red Cross is one of those that has a really important mandated function, in particular to visit and monitor conditions of detention for prisoners of war. And in international armed conflicts, that's a hard duty. It's a responsibility for states to facilitate that access and monitoring of treatment of prisoners of war by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And in situations of non-international armed conflict, the ICRC, the Committee of the Red Cross, can offer its services to do that as well. So these are, a range of the monitoring and compliance mechanisms that are in place under the rules, both at the domestic and international level.
Is the Red Cross getting access to prisoners of war in the conflict in Gaza?
I just missed the beginning of that, but
is the Red Cross getting access? Is the Red Cross getting access to prisoners of war in this armed conflict? You're clearly not getting access to the hostages, but are you getting access to people who have been arrested or who'd seized during the Gaza campaign?
So in this type of conflict, we have different types of detainees as they would be categorised under the law. So not so much prisoners of war, but as you just said, hostages in Gaza who unfortunately the ICRC do not have access to, although they were able to facilitate the release of a number of those hostages early on in the conflict, as I believe you're probably all aware. On the other side, in Israel, there are those who are detained there. And the International Committee of the Red Cross had access to those detainees before the 7th of October, so for a long time, in good partnership with the Israeli authorities. They have not been able to access those detainees since the 7th of October last year, no.
Thank you.
And if I may add, this is a clear violation of international humanitarian law, because the International Committee of the Red Cross has not only in an international armed conflict access to prisoners of war, but everyone who is not a prisoner of war is a protected civilian. even if they have committed crimes, they must be punished for that crimes, but they remain protected civilians, and the ICC, as Mrs. Clement correctly said, from 1967 until the 7th of October last year, had always access to all Palestinians detained by Israel, while since the 7th of October it does no longer have access, and that's a clear violation. Here we don't have, like with the bombings, doubts, what was the real target and so on. It's a violation which you may consider is less serious, but you have to realize there are very serious allegations of torture, and no one monitors that. And if I may just clarify one point about the ICC monitors, but you cannot benefit from that because they work confidentially. So they monitor, and they will speak with both parties to try to bring them to the respect, but they will not make, except in very exceptional cases, a public report or a report to the state parties, which makes it more difficult to third states. But I fully understand why the ICC privileges access and humanitarian assistance over criticizing violations, but it makes it more difficult to third states, like the United Kingdom, to fulfill their obligation to ensure respect, because states do not only have to respect, but also to make sure that other states respect. And how do you know whether a state respects or doesn't respect? And this is a very controversial issue now, whether Western states should still supply weapons, for instance, to Israel. And certainly if they know that there is a risk of that these weapons are used to violate IHL, they should stop that. But here is the controversy, and a lot of Western states say we have not sufficient indications that these weapons are used to violate humanitarian law.
So, Professor Sassoli, you started to touch on my next question, which is, so my last question was about the monitoring of international humanitarian law. I wonder if you could talk me through the mechanisms for the enforcement of international humanitarian law, and whether you could tell me what you think the sort of strengths and weaknesses have been in the enforcement with regards to the conflict in Gaza.
Well, I think there's a general agreement that the enforcement mechanisms are not sufficient, but states do not want to have more efficient enforcement mechanisms. And this is not only true for humanitarian law, for many other fields of international law. States do not want to have a world court, they don't want to have a world police, they don't want to have a world government. So, as Claire Clement explained, we have to have the states themselves making the law be respected. The International Committee of the Red Cross and Switzerland suggested very, very nice additional mechanisms, nice in the sense not very tough ones, but even this was refused by states, and therefore we have to live with what we have. But it would be good if there were additional mechanisms, and perhaps because of this lack of mechanism, theoretically, the UN Security Council could take action, and it has taken action in the past, but obviously if one of the parties is either a permanent member, Russia, Ukraine, or is systematically protected by a permanent member, then the Security Council cannot take any measure. And it would be good, yes, if there was a better enforcement mechanisms, also because today, in my personal view, too many hopes are put on the International Criminal Court, and this can be ruinous for the International Criminal Court because humanitarian law contains mainly obligations for states and for armed groups, and it must be enforced against them. And there, the typical subjects of international law, which are states, we don't have efficient mechanisms to make them respect, to enforce, as you put it, because monitoring, I think the ICSE does a lot of work, but we don't know what successes they have because it is confidential. But I'm convinced that the situation would even be worse if the ICSE was not trying to work. But you are right, we would need, not only for IHL, also for human rights, or even for international trade law, we would need more efficient enforcement mechanisms, but states don't want to have them because
Can I ask you, Professor, on that, because you're talking about how states don't want to give up sovereignty to have more effective enforcement. Is your feeling that we're moving in the wrong direction as an international community on that? So we hear Putin talking about a multipolar world. We've got a more arguably sovereigntist American president at the moment. Is it becoming less likely that we have effective mechanisms for enforcement?
I don't think the situation has worsened. In terms of enforcement mechanisms, simply we would need additional ones. And indeed, the United Nations were planned as having, through the Security Council, an enforcement mechanism which can take binding measures and which can authorize the use of force or send troops. But as you know, this doesn't work, especially now with the divide and permanent members disagreeing between each other. Unfortunately, the mechanism which is foreseen by international law and which would also cover humanitarian law. And we have seen in the former Yugoslavia that the Security Council was able to take measures against violations of humanitarian law. Obviously, there's always a risk of double standards, and that can only underline what Mrs. Clement said, that we are, and I understand your committee is concerned about Gaza, but if you look at violations of humanitarian law in the Democratic Republic of Congo, many more civilians are killed than in Gaza. And no one speaks about that. And she mentioned Sudan, and I could make a long list.
I'm so sorry to cut across you, Professor. As ever, when I seem to chair these meetings, we seem to be running out of time. Your evidence is so interesting, and I appreciate that I'm exactly making the point that you want to make, which is that we don't talk sufficiently about breaches of IHL in other countries, but we are just focusing on Gaza today. And I wondered if I could perhaps move the conversation on and ask Afra if she has any questions.
Yes, thank you, both of you. Professor Sassoli, you touched on this briefly in your answer to Blair about the actions that the UN Security Council could take, and I just wondered if you could elaborate on what kind of functions and powers, if any, the UN Security Council have in initiating and guaranteeing and enforcing ceasefires.
Initiating and guaranteeing ceasefires is not an IHL task, but it's very important from a humanitarian point of view, because in my view it would be more important to stop wars than to get them respect IHL. But as long as, unfortunately, there are wars, we need IHL. So the ceasefires, that's a typical task of the United Nations Security Council. It could send, under the UN Charter, it could send troops. And sometimes it has authorized the use of force. But this is about the legality of using force. It could also, when there are violations of international humanitarian law, The Security Council has, since 30 years, considered that violations of international humanitarian law also threaten international peace and security, and therefore it could take measures, and it has in the past. When there was a consensus between the permanent members, it has taken sanctions against states which violated international humanitarian law. But again, this is only possible if the majority agrees and no permanent member disagrees.
Claire, do you have anything to add on that?
Sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of your...
Sorry, I was wondering whether Claire Clement had anything that she wanted to add on that point.
Well, I completely agree with Professor Sassoli, and just to say that cessation of hostilities is referred to under IHL, but absolutely right that it's not sort of regulated under IHL, so it's more for the parties to the conflict themselves to negotiate that. And then there may be other countries and other interested parties that assist in that as well. But absolutely right that humanitarian considerations can be very important when negotiating a ceasefire. And we've seen examples of ceasefires that have been negotiated on two tracks, for example. There's a political track to it, and there may be a humanitarian track to that as well, which is done separately in order to ensure that elements of the humanitarian side of things are taken care of in a way that is separate from the political consideration. So that ensures the safeguarding of populations, the return of detainees and prisoners of war, those sorts of things. But it's all up to the parties to the conflict themselves to be able to negotiate and to agree those things. And in terms of UN Security Council involvement, exactly as Professor Sassoli has said, it depends on the members and the political will of them.
Thank you very much. Edward, I think you've got some questions.
I just wanted to return to a point that you made earlier on, Professor, which was about the fact that Britain has been supplying weapons to Israel during this conflict period, although we have withdrawn numerous export licenses. I'm just wondering, if Britain supplies weapons that are used in a proven violation of IHL, do we have a legal culpability?
I mean, you can never, if you supply weapons, you can never be sure that they will never be used to violate humanitarian law. The standard as laid down by the ICSC commentaries to this Article 1 common to the Geneva Convention is when there is a clear risk that the weapons will be used in violations of humanitarian law, and you can establish that. Obviously, you can never foresee the future. So you must evaluate this based on the past conduct of a party. And so, I don't know, if you supply submarines, well, I'm not aware of any possible violation by Israel with submarines, while if these are guided missiles, then comes the question where they sometimes used against targets which are not military objectives. And obviously all this is also delicate because the example of the guided missile, it's perhaps not so relevant for Israel because they have very sophisticated weapons. Sometimes if you give sophisticated weapons, it facilitates the respect of humanitarian law compared with dumb bombs. And so it's a dilemma, but certainly a state must, when it provides weapons to a warring party, take also measures to monitor and to ensure compliance with those rules of international humanitarian law.
Thank you very much. Claire Clement, a slightly expanded question, if I may, which is, what is, when it comes to the conflict in Gaza and the broader Middle East, what is the UK doing to ensure all sides are adhering to international humanitarian law, and what should we be doing if there's stuff that we're not?
Well, thanks very much for that important question. I mean, the role, just to clarify, the British Red Cross is not to comment publicly really on what the UK is or isn't doing in relation to ensuring IHL is complied with in this sort of conflict and in other sorts of conflicts. We deal generally directly and privately with the UK government as their humanitarian auxiliary to try and promote better adherence to IHL and implementation of its rules. So just with that important clarification to say that I think the UK, like various other countries, has an important role to play in encouraging better implementation of IHL in this context and also in other contexts as well. It can do that through its diplomatic relations, of course. It is doing that from what we understand and know and work with at every turn, but that can always be more effective and more widespread as well. So using its full, diplomatic leverage would be, certainly appreciated and encouraged by us and by other organisations as well. I think over the longer term, there are ways in which the UK can really champion its role as a long-standing leader in IHL as well. For a long time, the UK has really pioneered quite innovative means of ensuring better compliance with IHL, including, for example, instigating more countries engaging in voluntary reporting on IHL. So the UK has just published its own second voluntary report on implementation of IHL. It's leading by example in terms of showing how it implements and complies with the rules in its own space, and it's encouraging other states and working with other states to do that as well. For example, Ukraine has just released its first voluntary IHL report. Again, these things are not mandatory. The name of it suggests all of it. It's a voluntary report. However, these are steps towards better transparency among countries who are willing to engage in that around how exactly they're implementing the rules and adhering to those. So there are certain things that the UK could be doing in the diplomatic sphere as well as the technical IHL sphere, working peer-to-peer with other countries to be able to ensure better compliance with IHL.
Does anybody have any further questions? I'd like to thank you very much for coming today and for giving your evidence in the clear way that you have. It has been incredibly important to us. I'd also like just to put onto the record our gratitude to the Select Committee legal advisors for the advice that they've also given and the help they've given to us in preparation for today. We're only running slightly over, so I think it's amazing. But thank you very much for giving your time to us today. And if there is anything that you feel that we have not asked you about that was important, or anything additional that you think that we should know about, please do write and add that to your evidence. But I'm going to bring today's hearing to a close. Order.